Good morning, everyone from Bangkok, Thailand, and good afternoon to those who are in Hawaii. I hope everyone is doing well and ready for the holidays. My name is Panwin Yoking. I am a fellow at the U.S Center, and it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here moderating today's session. To those who are new to the event, welcome to EWC Insights, Asia Pacific Political Transitions. To those who have attended our past sessions, welcome back and thank you for joining us again. Our session this afternoon features a presentation from Laura Saalman. Dr. Saalman is an associate senior fellow at Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, an adjunct senior fellow at the U.S Center, and also a member of the Committee on International Security and Arms Control. She has worked for various institutes, including the East-West Institute, Daniel K. Inouye's Center, Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, Wisconsin Project on Nuclear Arms Control, as well as Observer Research Foundation and Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, from which she earned a one-year fellowship at International Atomic Energy Agency. She was the first American to earn a doctorate from Tsinghua University's Department of International Relations and completed all of her coursework in Chinese. And in her talk today, she will explore Chinese view on multi-domain strategic stability, as well as recent spate of military advances to examine whether China's becoming more like the United States and Russia is a stabilizing or destabilizing phenomenon. Before we get started, just a brief note on the session's logistics. Dr. Saalman's presentation will be approximately 40 minutes long. Then we will transition to a 20-minute Q&A session. And I encourage all attendees to share your questions and comments in the Q&A box. And we will try our best to get through as many questions as possible during the Q&A session. And lastly, I would like to make a quick announcement that the next speakers of this series on Asia Pacific political transitions will be Lily Song, and her talk will be on January 19th at 2 p.m. And the title of her talk is Maritime Boundary Disputes in the South Pacific. Without further ado, I will now hand this over to Dr. Saalman to start her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Yoking, for your kind introduction, also in moderation of the session. I'd also like to thank Dr. Fox, Dr. Roy for their invitation, as well as the East-West Center for this opportunity, and the center's entire staff, in particular, Ms. Leach and Ms. Iguchi, for their terrific arrangements for my talk today. So as mentioned at the outset, I'll be speaking about deterring the United States, China, and multi-domain strategic stability. This concept of multi-domain strategic stability, just as a backgrounder for everyone who is listening, really, I attribute a lot of this to work that is happening at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories and the work of Brad Roberts, who really first introduced me to that term. So for those who are interested, there is a great deal of new literature that is out there on this topic. But today I'll be specifically exploring it in the context of China. So while politically China and the United States are farther apart than ever, there are indications that China's space, cyber, and nuclear strategies are intersecting with the United States, as well as Russia, with implications for strategic stability. So as just mentioned, one of the key questions that I've been exploring through my research is, does China becoming more like the United States serve as a stabilizing or destabilizing phenomenon? To address this question, I will briefly explore China's conceptual and technological developments and some of their implications. So in essence, two concepts have resonated during my research, namely active defense, or 积极防御, and proactive defense, which is 主动防御. Active defense, in terms of my first initial research in Chinese language databases, had 18,000 references. So you can see a wide array within these references of interest in this term. This is not a new concept, in other words, for those working on China, particularly in the nuclear arena. And where do you find this term? It generally is in mass media, but then also in military journals themselves. You'll see it, for example, in the People's Liberation Army Daily, Military History Studies, Decision Making and Information, which is another journal, and of course, the ever popular Global Times. But in essence, active defense adheres to the principle of strategic defense in combination with offensive action at the operational and tactical level. So what does that mean in essence? This term historically has been much more defensive in tone. Its emphasis is really on countermeasures against and responses to external aggression and coercion. Particularly in most cases, this external coercion would be coming from the United States in most of these Chinese writings. And of course, it is widely thought to be bound up with the concept of no first use, the idea that China will not be the first to use nuclear weapons during tensions or a conflict. Proactive defense, by contrast, really has fewer references within Chinese or in these databases. I found in my initial search 2,237 references. Where does proactive defense appear? In things which actually, interestingly enough, are more targeted military and technical journals. Things like Winged Missile, Modern Military, Technical Forum, the Home of Science and Technology Workers, Aerospace Control. These are some of the journals that tend to use this term and apply it actually in real world scenarios or certainly in technological developments. Now, this is a less commonly used concept, of course, in China. However, it also places more emphasis on offense over defense. And this is an important way to juxtapose it with active defense, right, which is more defensive. This is more offensive in tone. It tends to be largely applied in cyber, in the cyberspace domain, and to a degree, the space realm, to mean acting in anticipation to oppose an attack through offensive and defensive measures. But really the focus, once again, is more on offensive activities. These include things like interdicting, disrupting, or deterring attacks through asymmetric offense that overwhelms an opponent and increases costs. So inherent within this is, of course, a puzzle in terms of how these two terms have evolved basically in parallel, but there is an increasing sign that there is interaction between the two. And one could argue that these are simply semantic differences, yet the translation already of these two terms, particularly of United States documents, is revealing in terms of not only how China is looking at the United States, but also how it sees these terms operating in terms of strategy and force structure. For example, even when Chinese experts are citing U.S. official reports that use the term active defense, they tend to translate it using their more preemptive and offense-based term proactive defense. Now, this, of course, means that within the Chinese context, they're trying to establish the fact that the United States is more offensive while China is more defensive in tone. Yet the fact that we are starting to see this term, proactive defense, appear in Chinese language writings about China as well, I think also shows that there is increasing alignment across several domains, and those are space, cyber, and nuclear. And I'll talk about each of those and break those down briefly. On space, Chinese experts tend to apply proactive defense when referring to, for example, the 2021 version of the U.S. Space Force Doctrine and its reference to anti-satellite systems, as well as electromagnetic and cyber operations against space assets. But however, at the same time, bolstering the chance that these very same concepts are being applied in China are things like recent revelations about its own development of ASAT weapons that explode in the exhaust systems of satellites, as well as China's own past ASAT tests. Furthermore, track 1.5 U.S. China strategic dialogues have revealed that in a conflict, China may also consider an attack on U.S. space assets. This is actually something discussed by Chinese experts in attendance at these talks. Now, for those of you who might not be as familiar with the terminology, a track 1.5 talk involves those who are in an official capacity and non-official capacity at these talks. And who have directly referred to the potential for China to use such offensive actions. Now, given the entangled nature of these systems, the chances for escalation from a conventional to nuclear crisis remains if such a preemptive approach is used. And by entangled, of course, I mean that many of the communication satellites that we're talking about can serve dual purposes, right? They have their own conventional and nuclear applications. On cyber, Chinese experts are most clear I would argue, in their shift towards proactive defense and their alignment with the US application of the term. They focus on the importance of engaging in proactive defense to shift away from passive defense, what they refer to as 被动防御. Now, while Chinese writings, of course, once again point to the United States, and for example, the 2018 US National Cyber Strategy as using or applying proactive defense, they are also explicit that China's own efforts are evolving in order to preemptively address cyber attacks on their own critical infrastructure. So this technological discussion is highly reliant on both hardening these systems against attack, against cyber attack, as well as offensive operations to intercept and destroy malware. On the third component of all of this, so I have space, cyber, and nuclear. On nuclear, Chinese writings highlight the 2017 US joint publication on countering air and missile threats, and its use of proactive defense to undertake actions to destroy, eliminate, or reduce the effectiveness of such threats. So in other words, a lot of this is tied to missile defense. This, of course, points to Chinese concerns over US pursuit and expansion of its missile defense aims. And of course, this ability to weaken China's second strike capability. So survivability is inherent within this. Now, however, at the same time, as China seeks out means of defeating US missile defenses, there is a proactive element. For example, most recently, many of you have probably through media reports and otherwise seen China's testing of its hypersonic glide vehicle on a fractional orbital bombardment system, or read, of course, about its mounting of multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, or MIRVs, on its DF-41 ICBM, expansion of its ICBM silos, which has been documented by several think tanks and organizations. And from all of these different evolutions within China's nuclear force structure, it could be seen to be undertaking a more proactive approach and moving towards this concept of proactive defense. Now, given these various formulations, perhaps it's not surprising that there is a conflation within China of the two concepts of active defense and proactive defense that I see, at least in my own review of Chinese literature, is growing. And this is particularly seems to be the case, interestingly enough, among some Chinese cyber experts. Now, because the majority of space, cyber, and nuclear communities in China remain siloed, so in other words, they're each in their own individual subsections within China's either military or civilian structure, a degree of this crossover is mitigated. However, as China dissects and potentially even integrates its own version of US concepts like left of launch, jointness of military forces, and in particular left of launch, which includes a preemptive cyber attack on missile or nuclear infrastructure, there is a greater chance of proactive defense bleeding into Chinese space, nuclear, and other fields. So to explain this and where I see this potentially evolving, I'd like to just end my talk by talking about practice before I get to the conclusion. So in terms of practice, there are postural and technological indicators that already suggest that some of the markers of active defense may be shifting towards this proactive stance. The first that I would like to highlight is demating. And in this case, a shift towards pre-mating. What is demating? Demating has traditionally been that China's nuclear warheads are not mated to its delivery systems during peacetime. This has been a staunch position of China within its nuclear posture for many years now. However, China's sea trials of the Type 96 ballistic missile submarine, flight tests of the JL-3 intercontinental submarine launched ballistic missile, and expansion of its ICBM silos all indicate that this traditional nuclear posture is shifting and has to shift, really, right? Because they are, of course, fielding more systems, and a number of these systems require, for example, for an SSBN, that the system is already mated before they send it out to sea. Of course, they could redock and mate them during a crisis scenario down the line, but that's a very unusual form of behavior. While each of these platforms remains tied to China's second strike capability, the likely pre-mating of nuclear warheads to platforms suggests the potential for accidents, issues with communication or delegation that might occur at sea with an SSBN. It also, frankly, suggests a shift towards launch on warning that I'll talk about in a few minutes. So in these cases, while active defense remains the posture that China will officially articulate for the foreseeable future, such incidents may result in proactive defense actually being applied in practice. The second that I would like to focus upon is the size of China's nuclear arsenal. This historically has been kept at low numbers in the realm of around 350 warheads. Now, China's shift, of course, from minimum to limited deterrence, and there's been a great deal of discussion of this potential shift by individuals like Evan Medeiros and Ian Johnston, among others. But it would demand an increase in the number of warheads. And of course, it's been strengthened by China's alleged development of MIRVs that I mentioned earlier, its expansion of its missile silos to potentially house the DF-41 ICBM, as well as its shift towards SLBMs and other platforms. So many of these trends that I've already mentioned. So while China currently maintains an arsenal that, even if it expands, is smaller than that of the United States and Russia, these delivery system advances indicate that its nuclear forces are growing. And recent U.S. Department of Defense estimates, if you've read the most recent report, of 700 deliverable nuclear warheads by 2027 and at least 1,000 warheads by 2030, of course, indicate that this may be much greater than many have anticipated in the past and a faster ramping up of its numbers. Whether or not such growth leads to parity, it still indicates that China is in a much stronger position to undertake proactive operations. And when I talk about proactive operations, it's not just nuclear. I mean, nuclear stands in the background of conventional operations in the region and abroad. And I just want people to keep that in the back of your mind. This is not just about one domain. The third of these, of course, is launch on warning. And I alluded to this earlier when I was talking about pre-mating. This, of course, launch on warning is based on a higher alert status and an ability to engage in a rapid ICBM launch in the event that satellites and other early warning sensors detect an incoming strike. This is something, of course, that the United States and former Soviet Union and, of course, Russia have put into practice in their own arsenals. Now, following a 2014 Chinese publication on building a strategic early warning system, China is alleged to have launched communication satellites to support launch on warning as early as 2015. More recently, indications are that China has expanded, of course, its missile silos, as I mentioned earlier, the pre-mating of nuclear warheads to delivery systems, and is favoring solid-fueled ballistic missiles, which, of course, are, in terms of their fueling, they don't need to be fueled the way a liquid fueled missile would be. So they're able to be launched more quickly. All of this suggests that its infrastructure will also support a much higher alert level. Once again, a more proactive stance. Fourth among these is dual capable systems. These are systems which feature delivery platforms and command and control infrastructure that support both nuclear and conventional military operations. Such systems are thought to include China's DF-26 intermediate range ballistic missile, its DF-ZF hypersonic glide vehicle, which is now making its appearance on various platforms, the H-6N strategic bomber, and the CJ-20 air-launched land attack cruise missile, as well as a range of unmanned aerial vehicles and underwater vehicles, unmanned underwater vehicles that are under development. In particular, China's test of its hypersonic glide vehicle on a fractional orbital bombardment system, as we saw recently, could be seen as a sizable step towards not only a dual capable platform, but one that could be applied to respond to a conventional or nuclear attack. This is largely, once again, pointing to that entanglement issue that I mentioned earlier. If your nuclear and your conventional command and control systems, also your platforms, if there's an ambiguity about these and what the intention is behind them, then in an attack situation or a conflict, a crisis, you could see very easily escalation occurring. The fifth among these, and the last on the list that I would highlight, is machine learning and autonomy. These enable systems to learn from data and experience to operate with limited to no human intervention. This is, of course, a relatively nascent issue, yet there's been an extensive amount of Chinese research into neural networks, integrating them into hypersonic glide platforms. And this is really to heighten their maneuverability and evasion capabilities. So it's used in targeting to a certain extent. China's advances in hypersonic glide vehicles suggest their future potential deployment on ICBMs and fractional orbital bombardment systems. In fact, I had a really interesting discussion recently, or was part of one, as to what the end game is, right? Are these to be mounted on ICBMs? Are they actually are just testing them out on fractional orbital bombardment systems? What is the goal really for these hypersonic glide vehicles? But it's not just about them. It's also China's fielding of things like UAVs and UUVs, so the underwater systems and the aerial systems, which may in the future, similar to Russia, carry nuclear payloads. I think we have to think about that potentiality, or at least conduct more research on it. Often, China is more ambiguous than Russia is about the payload. So China's inclusion of this range of new delivery vehicles could further exacerbate the escalatory issues of discrimination and entanglement. And I'm thinking now about, of course, in the Russian case, Poseidon, right? There's been a good deal of discussion about the Poseidon delivery system, which would be an unmanned underwater vehicle with a nuclear payload. Whether China might in the future consider that is something worth analysis and discussion. So in conclusion, for Chinese experts, there remains really still this emphasis on addressing concerns over its inability to anticipate and respond to attacks. They're very much still focused on survivability, second strike, all of the hallmarks of active defense. So I want to emphasize that proactive defense is not replacing active defense. Active defense will still be around for the foreseeable future. It definitely will be around in most of the mainstream media coverage and also in official statements. However, if this side shift towards proactive defense is occurring with a focus in China on not being passive, and I think these cases that I have illustrated today point in that direction, then China may employ increasingly more US strategies, more Russian strategies, particularly in the space and cyber realm, and potentially even the nuclear domain. So with this, I return to the question that I asked at the outset. Does China becoming more like the United States, and to an extent Russia, serve as a stabilizing or destabilizing phenomenon? While Chinese nuclear policies, and as I mentioned at the outset, translations, have long sought to distinguish China from the United States, its strategies in space, cyber, and nuclear fields demonstrate a degree of crossover, and that degree of crossover is growing. Thus, while China's conceptual and technological crossover enable more assertive behavior that could be destabilizing, for the various reasons that I've already mentioned, I would also like to, as I wrap up my talk today, talk about a few of the potentially stabilizing aspects that also merit further exploration when we think about this. So I don't want to be too binary about it, but at the same time, too, I think it's important that we understand that there are some positives alongside the negatives. What are these? The first is that these trends, of course, afford a better understanding of China's strategic posture, which, as I mentioned before, does, despite its declaratory policy being fairly straightforward, indicate a degree of ambiguity, right? If it starts to align more closely with the United States and Russia, certainly that dynamic and those two countries' policies and postures are better understood in various arms control circles. So I think it does offer a window into China and where it might be headed in the future. Launch on warning is a perfect example, pre-mating, all these different things that I mentioned, switching to solid fueled ballistic missiles, those types of things. Second, and this is one that I think is actually quite important, is they also place China on better footing for engagement with the United States and potentially even future trilateral strategic stability talks. You know, we talk a lot about would China come to the table, and I think most of us are in agreement, and China has been very explicit about not coming to the table for our trilateral talks with the United States and Russia. But this being said, they haven't completely negated the chance that they would come to the table for strategic stability talks with the United States. Yes, they have as of late expressed ongoing reticence about this. However, when it comes to track 1.5 talks and in track 0.2 talks, so in other words, entirely unofficial or populated by those who have retired talks, or talks that even have a few officials at the table, there seems to be a greater willingness. And I'm basing this off of my recent participation in Changshan Forum and elsewhere where I raise this potentiality. There is an interest there, at least at the track 1.5 level. And of course, the track 1.5 level is a staging zone for hopefully track 1 level talks. And why is this happening? I would argue this is really the case if China's longstanding argument of its asymmetric weakness precluding its engagement with countries like the United States begins to diminish. China has long argued that it's the weaker power, right? It has a smaller arsenal. It doesn't have the same capabilities or nuclear force structure and space and cyber, frankly, that the United States or Russia have. And that's why it's not participating. If China is actually moving in this direction where it's more similar to these other countries, I think a case can be made, a convincing one, to compel China to come to the table. And the argument could be made that they would feel they would have more leverage during those talks as well. So once again, I'm not arguing that this will go immediately to the track 1 level, but I think this merits greater exploration of the track 2 and track 1.5 level for finally engaging China on some of these hard issue areas that have been hard to talk to them in the past about. So with that, I'd like to wrap up my comments for today, and I look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saalman, for the informative talk. And we have a set of questions for you. And the first set of questions pertains to China's nuclear capabilities. And then we'll move on to the questions about China's strategic defense. So the first question is, some analysis say that the US government doesn't accept China's nuclear capability, the way that the US had an understanding with the Soviets during the Cold War. What does this mean, and do you agree?
Thank you very much for that question. It's an important one because there have been pieces written as of late, recently, actually by one of my former classmates, Zhao Tong, who is working at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, talking about mutual vulnerability and the importance of the United States being willing to accept mutual vulnerability vis-a-vis China. Now, this discussion has been around for a while now. It actually came about, this is not a new discussion, in other words. And in fact, if you look at the Nuclear Posture Review from 2010, so the one under the Obama administration, there was an effort, it seems, from the United States to recognize to an extent this mutual vulnerability relationship. Now, that tacit recognition, without explicitly stating mutual vulnerability, in essence, was done through several means. One of them was to link China and Russia, to say that, to basically use them in the same sentences, the same paragraphs, thereby indicating, well, we have a mutual vulnerability type of relationship with Russia. So the United States also, by extension, has one with China. Now, from my interactions with Chinese experts after that came out, it actually backfired to an extent. Whether it consciously backfired or unconsciously backfired on the Chinese side is a point of debate. However, the fact is that linkage that was made between China and Russia was perceived in China as being making China into a little Russia or a little Soviet Union. So implicit within that is the idea that the United States was seeing it as an adversarial relationship and trying to put it on similar footing to what occurred during the Cold War. And so anyone who has worked on China knows about this whole mantra about Cold War thinking, and that the United States is wedded to Cold War thinking. This fed directly into that discussion. And so I think that the United States has put out feelers in the past to say that mutual vulnerability exists without doing it explicitly. And it hasn't exactly worked the way they wanted it to work. And I just wanted to give one other example of it in that same document. That whole move towards lower nuclear numbers, right? That was predicated on the idea that the United States was moving towards two things: conventional prompt global strike and missile defense, right? That these were the two things that were going to be put in place essentially to allow the United States to get to lower nuclear numbers. Also backfired in China. It was seen as missile defense, of course, is already seen as operationally offensive and destroying their second strike capabilities, right? And then on top of it, conventional prompt global strike, of course, is, even if it's conventional, it's conflating a lot of these concerns they had about decapitating strikes, taking out China's nuclear arsenal, which is smaller at that time, and it still remains small. So once again, I think that the United States has shown an interest in mutual vulnerability and recognizing it, but it hasn't done so explicitly. Whether or not the new nuclear posture review under the Biden administration attempts to go in the same direction that the Obama administration did, I think it may. There are indications that it will on things like sole purpose that we can talk about as well. But that being said, I think it needs to be cautious about how it's done, because in acknowledging mutual vulnerability, if the steps that you're taking increase that sense of threat on the Chinese side, I don't think it's achieving what it's meant to achieve.
I see. Got it. Thank you for the response. The next question also focuses on China's nuclear capability. And the question is, why should the USA be concerned about even a large increase in Chinese nuclear weapons, perhaps to 1,000 when the US has over 5,000?
That's a great question. And I don't think, there are actually quite a few people in the US as well who would probably argue that it shouldn't. that it's not necessary, that this actually, in a way, and this is one of those stabilizing points that I mentioned earlier, whether China has 350 or 1,000 nuclear warheads, the point is that there needs to be greater discussion about crisis management. There needs to be greater interaction between the two so that you don't end up with an ambiguous situation like vis-a-vis the attacks on space assets that was mentioned earlier, right? That would occur during a conventional scenario, but have a nuclear or potentially nuclear fallout from that. So I think that getting China to the table is the important point. And if having 1,000 nuclear warheads makes China feel comfortable enough to come to the table to finally sit down with the United States and even, Russia as trilateral or bilateral at the track one level, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that the one issue, of course, for any country, including the United States, the more you expand your arsenal, the more you have points of potential accidents or, misuse, potential launch, especially if they're moving towards launch on warning. Those are the things that I'm more concerned about than necessarily the numerics of it. I think if anything, it just puts China on a better footing to feel more comfortable about coming to the table. Last point I would make is, and I was just on a call the other week with Chinese experts talking about this, for China, as long as the United States, the genie is out of the bottle with the missile defense. The United States does not seem to be moving in the other direction. It's the one thing there's bipartisan agreement on, right, is missile defense in the United States. So as long as the US is pursuing that, China is going to pursue means of overcoming missile defense, right? And one of those things is going to be numbers. So once again, I wouldn't put the numbers, I wouldn't put as much emphasis on those as I would on the fact that it actually might enable them to come to strategic talks or negotiations.
Got it. Thank you. Next question, still under the topic of nuclear weapons. Do you expect the Chinese government to renounce no first use of nuclear weapons?
I think that the Chinese government will not renounce no first use of nuclear weapons. In 2013, I believe it was, they had a white paper that came out that left out no first use. And there was a huge amount of debate about it in the West, right? All of a sudden, various experts were writing about it. James Acton, another former colleague of mine, of course, published a piece on what exactly was occurring. Why had they left no first use out of this one white paper? When I went back and I talked to PLA or former PLA members who about this particular omission of no first use, they said, look, this was a different type of white paper. This is not the same template of white paper that we use in the past, where no first use is an automatic write-in. And there could be debate about that, right? Why it was omitted from this one piece, but it was important because if you look at it in the reaction that they received, ever since that point in time, despite the fact that there is a debate about no first use in China, there is definitely not within the official rhetoric walking back of no first use. If anything, they're trying to strengthen their stance on no first use and say, we will never leave no first use. And now they have even more of a reason. Why is that? Because, of course, if the United States is debating sole purpose, and sole purpose, of course, would be if we think about no first use as not being the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict, sole purpose would be the United States not signing on to that per se, but saying that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter nuclear weapons. So there's a difference there, right? However, it's seen as being a concession to the Chinese side to try to express the fact that the United States is willing to at least acknowledge no first use and in its own policies to have a shift, right, from nuclear warfighting. As long as China sees that potentiality under the Biden administration, they have even more of a reason to strengthen their stance on no first use and say that it's not going anywhere in the near future. This being said, I think it's important to understand that there is discussion, there is debate. There are individuals in China who have talked about no first use. They tend to be people who are retired from either military or officials. There have been pieces written by Major General Pan Jinqiang, who was retired himself, about no first use in this debate, which we're not always privy to, right, in open sources. There is also, most recently in September of this year, there was a talk given by the former representative, vice representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Xia Zhukang, basically arguing that China should relinquish its no first use just vis-a-vis the United States, largely based on the fact that they see the United States as being provocative and aggressive towards China across the spectrum, right? Politically, economically, militarily, in every sphere. So there is a voice in China saying that they should do this. However, that voice tends to be in their own personal capacity. So in conclusion, I don't see the government relinquishing their no first use commitment. However, the people need to be aware that this debate is going on, this discussion is going on, and these are influential individuals in China. They're not just random strategists or armchair strategists on TV talking about it.
Got it. This is very interesting. The next question is still focusing on China's nuclear capability. And the question is, when China had a small but survivable nuclear force in the 60s and 70s, they actively publicized their capability to survive and to respond to any attack. Are they as open today?
You mean in terms of survivability, or to their survivability against attack? I would say that, I mean, I think that they're actually much more open today because it's not just a rhetorical statement, right? In the past, they would say that they, of course, had this capability to survive an attack. I think today, because of these, and in their view, and I think to an extent they're very correct, legitimate concerns about things like missile defense cutting off their survivability. Because of that, I think that they have been demonstrating that these technological capabilities and these abilities to evade and overcome and even preempt and potentially in some cases U.S. missile defenses. I think it's an important change, a shift from just the rhetoric of saying that they have survivability to actually demonstrating it in the field, right? And the perfect example of this, of course, is the recent hypersonic glide vehicle test on the fractional orbital bombardment system, right? That really was to indicate, to demonstrate, as much as it is domestically to test the system, but to demonstrate to the United States that they're working on these capabilities. And by the way, they're succeeding. And succeeding in ways that are surprising the United States. It's not, we should also remember the fact that the United States immediately came out on very senior, high-level people from the Pentagon, in some cases saying, we don't know how they did this. This took people by surprise. I mean, they want that reaction because they're gauging, first of all, how the U.S. reacts. And then secondly, they also want to prove to a certain extent that this survivability does exist, not only to themselves, but to the outside world.
Okay, so the next question pertains to the glide vehicle. How worried should the US be about China's hypersonic glide vehicle? What is the appropriate US countermeasure?
That's an excellent question. Well, here's the thing. I think that, and this is an interesting point too, that came out from discussions with Chinese experts about this recent test, is that the hypersonic glide vehicle, because there's a discussion about the fact the United States, of course, has been working on its own hypersonic glide vehicles, right? Conventional prompt global strike, that whole program in its various variants is focused on that particular platform. And some have said, well, why is the US lagging behind, so to speak? The argument, of course, from the Chinese side on this is that, well, why the US doesn't need a hypersonic glide vehicle, right? It's not a must-have. For China, it's a must-have. And it's a must-have for being able to overcome missile defense. That's the basic goal behind this entire system. Yet, I think that if there is a concern for the United States about it, of course, it's the ability to overcome missile defenses, right? If you're preoccupied with trying to make sure that U.S. missile defenses operate the way they are meant to operate and are successful, then this is a system that potentially challenges them. So there's that concern for those adherents to missile defense. On the other side, too, my concern always with these types of systems is that there's a lot of unpredictability still, right? With them, right? They're being developed. They have, for example, neural networks, machine learning is being built into them. There are a lot of issues in terms of control that I would be concerned about once they've been launched, right? They don't follow the predictable trajectory of an ICBM, right? They come in, they re-enter, and they start to maneuver. That's good for them evading missile defense, but it's bad from the sense of control down the line. I would be concerned about them potentially there being accidents, things going off the rails, that they have during a test, a potential accident that would occur. Those types of things concern me more than necessarily the fact that they're able to overcome missile defenses. I think that their ability to overcome missile defenses is, once again, really just about survivability, second strike capability, and so on. That being said, I can understand from the US perspective a concern about these being more preemptive, especially if this trend that I'm talking about with proactive defense starts to manifest itself in a more pronounced way.
Okay. Got it. The next question is, could you discuss more about the danger and the likelihood of an EMP attack on the US by China?
It's a great question. And it's not one that I have done as much research on in terms of China's own EMP developments. However, I do know that they've invested a good deal of time and energy into those. I also know that from my time, actually, while I was still working in Hawaii, I know it's a major point of interest and concern among U.S. experts, military, and so on. I think that potentiality is still there, but I don't know, at least from my own research, it's not something that has come out, at least in open literature, as much as these other capabilities. Now, that doesn't mean that obviously there isn't a lot of research that's occurring, that's happening at the classified level, and that I don't have access to. I am an open source researcher, so I can only work with what I'm able to gain access to. But I think, of course, here's the bottom line in all of this is that, like any country would, like China does itself, in anticipating where the United States is heading with its own military modernization program, the United States has to take into consideration that China is also engaged in the same developments. Every time the US is publishing, putting out their research, technological surveys, what have you, on a certain weapon system, it's being read in China, it's being developed in some form or another. Whether they deploy it and field it is another question, but they're certainly going to be putting in just as much time on how to develop countermeasures against it as they are to develop it themselves. And so as much as that discussion on EMPs is occurring in the United States with its own military, I think they need to take into consideration that the same thing is happening in China, whether we have access to it or not.
Okay. Got it. Moving on to China's strategic defense, the question is, what is driving China's movement from passive to active defense? China's improved capabilities or increased tensions with the USA?
That's a terrific question. I think it's both. That's my hedging way of answering that question. I mean, I think that a lot of I would say actually one of the things that really stands out, certainly in my survey of not just Chinese literature, but television programs, debates that are occurring in China, the conferences I go to, the discussion, is the fact that there is a sense of, I don't call it hopelessness, but there is a sense that the United States is, it doesn't matter which administration, right? It could be a Republican in office, it could be a Democrat in office, that the United States is taking a much more proactive and frankly aggressive stance towards China. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not just military. This is politically, this is economically, this is across the boards. And they see it coming from all levels of the US government. And because of that, there is a sense that they need to push back. And push back demonstratively, not only through rhetoric, as we saw from, of course, the 1960s, but now also in real terms, something that is more visible. And I think that's just also as much a function of Chairman Xi Jinping, right? When Xi Jinping came into office, you immediately saw, I mean, I was living in China at the time, you immediately saw, I would argue, a shift beginning in China towards being more forthright, standing up for itself, right? And if you, in the US, of course, that's going to be characterized as aggression or being more assertive. When China, it's that sense of finally coming into its own. And I think that once again is a much broader development within China. It's not just military, but military, frankly, is still how you back everything up, right? You can have all the political statements you want all day and all the economic statements. At the end of the day, the military is standing in the background, shoring that up. And I think that the Chinese leadership has been cementing that. And I think that the US strong approach towards China has also cemented that. So a lot of these technological developments that we see, they've been going on for a while, right? You don't just test your hypersonic glide vehicle coupled to your fractional orbital bombardment system in a few weeks. You don't just conduct most of these tests, or suddenly these things don't appear out of the blue. Maybe they do in some cases. I guess the silos, some could argue they appeared out of the blue. But the point is that these are shifts that have been occurring for, say, a decade or more. Hypersonic glide vehicles, I saw writings about those coming out pretty much, I would say, right after the US put into its nuclear posture review that it was pursuing conventional prompt global strike. These are things that, technologically speaking, the minute that the United States shows not just an interest in it, but is developing it, you're going to see technological journals writing about it, universities, everyone. And so these technologies are not new, but the willingness to demonstrate them, I think that's the part that kind of backs up this whole wanting to push back against the United States for putting pressure on China.
Okay, got it. We have about 12 minutes left, so I'm gonna move on to the next 5 or 6 questions. Next questions pertain to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. What are the implications of the new capabilities for the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Does it even matter anymore at this point?
That's a great question. I think that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, of course, has been under strain for quite a while now. This is not, and it's not unique to China. I don't think that China, in other words, China having these developments is spelling the demise of the NPT. I think that if anything, it's probably more under threat, though, from the fact that you have so many states that feel that the nuclear weapons powers are not moving towards disarmament, right? That they're not holding up their end of the bargain. So this Chinese nuclear modernization certainly doesn't help the NPT. But if you ask anyone in China, and they wouldn't be wrong, they would say, well, look at what the United States and Russia are engaged in. Right. The United States is having discussions, even whether it was the Trump administration and even under the Biden administration, about low yield nuclear weapons, right? Lowering the threshold on its nuclear weapons. Russia is engaged in developing all kinds of new platforms like Poseidon that I mentioned earlier, these unmanned underwater systems that are nuclear armed and carry a nuclear reactor on board, for goodness sakes. Those types of things, I think, have already been undermining it to begin with. The INF Treaty, of course, fell by the wayside. You have all kinds of examples from the US and Russia. So China is kind of, it's piling on, so to speak, in challenging the NPT, but it's certainly not the lone actor.
Okay, got it. The next question is, what is your assessment of the US, China, and Russia cyber capabilities, and are there disparities in capability that creates a strategic instability?
That's a great question. I would say, I mean, it's a little hard. It's tough within cyberspace, given the nature of cyber, because it's ethereal in its own way, right? To have a one-to-one comparison among all these countries. But I can certainly talk about some of the characteristics that I see coming out. I think that particularly in the Chinese case, one of the strengths that they've had in cyberspace is there's a strength and a weakness. So I'll point to those. So the strength, of course, for China has been historically and present day, of course, is the fact that the civil sector, so in other words, universities, industry, have really been able to play a key role in terms of its military cyber developments, right? Whether you're operating through the Ministry of State Security or others can task these different organizations, groups with coming up with the next form of, say, malware, or engaging in espionage, or whatever activity that they need, be it attack, espionage, or otherwise. And China's been very dominant in that regard. The United States, of course, has historically run into difficulties in trying to leverage Google and different private sector companies to necessarily sign on to, for example, Project Maven and different things that the United States has wanted to engage in, and in cyber as well. But that's shifting. The United States, of course, and actually CIPRI, I believe, has a report that's coming out in this regard that looks at the fact that there are more and more tech companies in the United States in the private sector that are willing to become part of these military programs that will be engaged in both defensive and offensive operations. So as that shift begins, I guess that in the United States, there's been a realization that keeping these too heavily firewalled does not necessarily serve the purposes of national defense, right? The Russian case is a tricky one. I think that they've also been successful, as we've seen. This is the whole issue of not just espionage, but also cyber attacks in the United States. They have a large amount of success as well. They have targeted bodies that are engaged in these activities. And there's been a great deal of pieces written about that. So I think as I look at the cyberspace arena among these three countries, I think they're becoming more and more similar, which probably should give us pause to begin with. But I think they're becoming more and more similar when it comes to cyberspace in terms of their capabilities than necessarily as stratified. The weakness that I wanted to mention before, and this probably applies to all of them, but particularly in the case of China that you hear commonly, is that they are too reliant on external platforms, Microsoft, among others. And if these companies are engaged with the Department of Defense and the national security sector in the future, there is, of course, going to be greater concern than there already is, that China will be vulnerable to even more cyber attacks. And that heightened sense of concern, I think, will also then have its own spiral effect.
Okay. We also have a related question focusing on cyberspace. Mm-hmm. How will China approach writing the global rules for cyberspace, especially as they relate to national security? And also, what are some of the elements that China will want to include in those rules?
That's a great question. I think that here's one of the interesting things about China in not just cyberspace, but also on artificial intelligence. And it's something that has increasingly stood out to me as I've attended or participated in various events within China itself, is that China is strongly involved in governance governance is really where China is trying to leverage the most, I'd say, long-term shaping ability. And I think they're doing that throughout the IT sector. So anything that's, or ICTs, I think that they're really trying to level the playing ground, so to speak, through writing the rules. Because if you're not, this is the common saying, right? If you're not a rule maker, you're a rule taker. And that hasn't served China well in the past. And so what is interesting to me is that a lot of times in China, when I'm invited, in fact, I was just invited the other week to give a talk at one of their technological universities. And I work on strategic stability, but they said, no, we want you on an AI and cyber governance panel, because that's what they want to talk about. That's what they're interested in. What are they interested in terms of conveying to the future? They're interested in things like cyber sovereignty, right? Cyber sovereignty, or this idea that a country's, in particular, a country's cyberspace is its own domain. It is very popular, very strong, and it has a lot of adherents within the country. And so cyber sovereignty, you hear quite a bit. It's a buzz term. What I find is interesting, because obviously I also operate in the European Union, is that their entire GDPR process of localization of data is somewhat similar to this concept of cyber sovereignty to an extent, right? It's the idea that you're keeping it within its own firewall, so to speak. We're creating our own mini firewalls. I think within China, that firewall has strengthened, not decreased over time. So cyber sovereignty is important. One last point I would make on this is that as they try to move into the governance sphere and have a greater shaping effect, we should also pay attention to everybody's favorite topic, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. Everyone likes to talk about it, but it has a cyber component, right? It has a digital infrastructure component that we need to think about as well. And so that digital Silk Road that you hear about is important, because China is not only shaping the governance, it's also shaping the infrastructure. Frankly, the way that the flattened IT infrastructure that these countries have. And that's very important, because it's going to shape not only the governance, but also access and accessibility, frankly, for China in those different networks.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes left, and I'm going to try and squeeze in as many questions as possible during this 3 minutes. The next question is there a racial component in the U.S. fear of China becoming an equal or greater power?
A racial component, gosh. I mean, it's, I think, what I find interesting about it is that, and not to diminish the question, because I think it's an important one. If you look at a lot of the concerns, the fears that you see coming out in the United States right now, it's not dissimilar to what you saw coming out about the Soviet Union and Russia, and that has come out about that country over time and its various permutations. And it's not to say that there isn't racial diversity within Russia. But if we want to make a racial argument that this is, that the United States is purely basing this on race, or that is a major component, I don't necessarily think that argument carries a lot of weight, because a lot of the concerns that I see, and part of the reason actually that the Chinese point to the Cold War discussion, right, this Cold War thinking on the part of the United States, is they are honestly concerned about China becoming a little Russia. And so I don't know that it's necessarily, I don't necessarily think that this is all about race. And so I think that certainly there are individuals in any country that have racist proclivities, but I don't think that that's necessarily the main underlying rationale.
Okay, got it. I know we only have 1 minute left, but I would like to make sure that I cover the remaining questions on the list here. So the next question is, do you believe that the US adoption of NFU or SP could have any stabilizing effect with respect to China's fear of receiving a US first strike? Or is US declaration of policy of little relevance to that issue?
Oh, that's a terrific question, particularly as the United States is debating this, I think, within its nuclear posture review under the Biden administration. Look, the point is that in my recent discussions, and that's not only my recent discussions, the discussions I've had at arms control talks with Chinese participants for decades now, showing my age. I think that the no first use discussion, no first use and missile defense are still as relevant to Chinese interlocutors today as they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. They are still the things that people fixate on. That being said, no first use, if you really scratch beneath the surface, I don't know that that declaration is going to do anything to change the fundamental issues of the technological imbalance that's seen, the national security threat that they see coming from the United States, militarily, economically, politically. No first use is not going to certainly do it. Sole purpose could certainly move things in a direction that China is more willing to sit down with the United States, right? If the US indicates it's more amenable to sole purpose and wants to talk to China about these issues and wants to have a meaningful discussion, I think the US is going to have to make some concessions. And one of those is going to be on sole purpose. And frankly, one of those is also going to have to be on missile defense, to sit down and to talk about it to a greater extent with China. Whether the US is willing to limit itself, it's hard to say. And whether, frankly, at the end of the day, any of these postural things make a difference and are going to cause China to step away from these technological developments, I'm not convinced. I'm like my colleagues in China, some of my colleagues who are very pessimistic. Much like the United States, it's invested how much into missile defense, into these systems? Is it going to walk away? Is China going to walk away? No. I think if we are talking about anything, it's going to be talking about not just development, but the use. So the employment of these systems. I don't think that we're going to have arms control negotiations of old. That's why we're moving towards strategic stability, right? Talks. Those are about employment, use. They're not about saying that we're not going to develop whatever the system is, A, B, and C anymore. And I think that's actually where we're headed. It's just destabilizing in its own sense, but it's an important discussion still to have, because it points to these issues of escalation that I mentioned earlier, and entanglement and all these types of things. And so I think that the United States declaration is not going to fundamentally change the game. At the most, though, it might get China to the table.
Okay, got it. I know we are 3 minutes over time, but there's one question left, so I'm going to squeeze in this one more question.
Sure.
Typically, China approaches U.S. desire for cooperation and confidence building talks as an opportunity to extract political concessions. Why would this not be the same for strategic stability talks?
Certainly, I think that it certainly is going to be part of the calculation for the United States in coming into strategic stability talks. Political concessions from either side are certainly going to be on the table. I think the issue is that for the United States, it needs to just balance on the whole. Is it better off not talking to China and potentially allowing a lot of these escalatory trends to just fester and ambiguities to potentially lead to miscalculation and miscommunication down the road? Or is it pay off to actually sit down with China and have a meaningful, hopefully, discussion? This is why I don't think that we can jump to the track 1 level right away. It has to start at the track 2, track 1.5, ideally, if possible, level, because then you can actually have discussions about scenarios. You can have discussions that I mentioned earlier about potential destabilizing things like attacks on satellites and so on during a conventional conflict. Those types of discussions can be held, and they can be probed, and they're more concrete, frankly, than just these discussions about postures and how postures have shifted over time. And so I think that political concessions are going to be, unfortunately or fortunately, part of the discussion for both sides. It's really about what the United States wants to get out of this. And I think, if anything, the United States can get, at the very least, a better sense of where red lines are, where some of these escalatory trends may be heading, particularly as we talk about conventional bleeding over into nuclear, which I am increasingly concerned about the more that I talk with Chinese and US interlocutors.
Okay, got it. Unfortunately, we went over time, but thank you everybody for staying with us until 8:05. But thank you very much, Dr. Saalman, for sharing your fascinating work and thoughts on this. And I would like to extend our big thanks to all our online audience for joining us this afternoon. And I would like to invite everybody back to our next EWC Insights on January 19th for a talk by Lily Song. And thank you again for being here with us. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.